So how many of you right now are running Windows and are completely fed up with Microsoft's bullcrap, trying to push Copilot, just Windows Update breaking things, just general slowness of Windows 11 compared to Windows 10, Microsoft cutting you out of hardware you already own with unnecessary hardware requirements for Windows 11, or maybe you're just tired of Microsoft having so much control over your computer and you want to take back control over your own hardware? Well, in that case, you might decide you want to switch to Linux. So I just wanted to make a guide that just has every bit of advice that I would tell a new user so people can reference this guide as they're transitioning to Linux. So this guide's going to go over everything you need to know, such as what type of hardware to pick when trying to run Linux, some distro recommendations for beginners, some tips for transitioning over to Linux, some concepts you should know once you install Linux onto your system, just everything I would want to know if I was getting started with Linux just to get a Linux system up and running. And that is the purpose of this guide. So let's start with the question, is Linux right for you? Because yes, I love Linux. I'm building a Linux distro. This is a Linux channel. But to be honest, if you live in the real world, there are going to be situations where Linux might not be right for you. And that is okay, but that is something we need to acknowledge before we blindly recommend everyone to be using Linux. So first off, Linux itself actually isn't an OS, so Linux is a kernel, which is basically the bridge between your hardware and your software. And Linux has quote unquote distributions that take the Linux kernel and build a new OS on top of it. So that way people can build their own operating systems without needing to build a giant complicated kernel to actually get hardware to work with their operating system. And so that is why you might actually be using Linux without realizing it. If you have an Android phone or a smart TV or a Wi-Fi router or smart home appliances, all of those run operating systems based on Linux because it saves the developers of the software for those devices from having to go out and engineer a full-on OS kernel, which is a huge technical challenge. That said, all these different distributions will work differently depending on the distro and the desktop environment you're using. So in this video, we're going to be focusing specifically on desktop use Linux distributions. We are not talking about servers. We are not talking about other hardware. So some of the reasons to use Linux is, like I said earlier, better control over your computer. It's all open source. You're not being controlled by a corporation. If Windows decided tomorrow that you could only use things on the Windows Store, if you were running Windows, you had no choice. Linux gives you control over your own system. You're not going to deal with forced AI, ads, forced accounts, telemetry, things like that. You get a lot of user choice within your desktop, your release/update cycle. You can even have custom kernels and swap out other system components. And additionally, Linux is lighter than Windows, so Linux is a great option for trying to revive older hardware. And so with all the control you get, you can have sort of a simple system like Ubuntu right here, no learning curve at all to use a Ubuntu desktop, or you can go all out. You could become a hacker. You can have a super customized system. This is some random screenshot I found on Reddit, but beautiful. Definitely not for beginners. This is keyboard driven, but again, you can have whatever workflow you want on Linux. That said, Linux is not a drop-in replacement for Windows, so Linux isn't always going to be easier to use. It's not guaranteed to support every app or game you use, and it's not something you should blindly install onto your main work machine without testing and knowing the compromises of Linux. So if all you do on your computer is general web browsing, maybe some programming and development work, maybe office or school work involving like word processing, spreadsheets, presentations, things like that, system administration, if you have an older computer, or you want a privacy-focused computing experience, even if you want to do some gaming and creative work, Linux may be a great choice for you. But notice I put an asterisk for gaming and creative work because gaming on Linux in 2026 is a great experience. In the past 15 years, it has came a long way thanks to Valve with Proton and the Steam Deck and now the Steam Machine. Actually, even the Steam Machine back in the day. But game compatibility isn't perfect, so a lot of games have to run through a compatibility layer called Proton that can basically translate Windows graphics code into Linux graphics code. And this works surprisingly well with the majority of games, but the biggest headaches are going to be multiplayer games with kernel level anti-cheat. If you have a bunch of friends that maybe play a game like Fortnite or Valorant, unfortunately, you're going to be that guy who says, I can't play Fortnite with you guys because I run Linux. Now, if you mostly play single player games or even multiplayer games that just don't have kernel level anti-cheat or they have Linux native ports, then you're good to go. But if you're a super hardcore gamer, I would still recommend having a dedicated gaming system. So either a gaming machine running Windows so that you can still play games like Fortnite and Valorant, or maybe like a video game console, like maybe just keep a PlayStation around for gaming and just use Linux for computing. Another thing to note is, I'm going to get to this in a second in more detail, but Nvidia is still a headache on Linux, although not as bad as it used to be. Now let's talk about doing office and schoolwork, because there is no desktop Microsoft Office on Linux, which can be a problem if you work for a company or go to maybe a university that heavily depends on Microsoft Office. That said, there are great alternatives. LibreOffice is the gold standard for Linux. They ship the open source, open document formats and things like that, and so a lot of open source people love LibreOffice. But for real world work, I actually tend to recommend OnlyOffice instead, because OnlyOffice is built around docx files, which are Microsoft Office files. It's what people use in the real world, unfortunately. Yes, LibreOffice does support docx files as well, but just OnlyOffice is completely made for docx files, so I think it's a more viable alternative for people to use OnlyOffice instead of LibreOffice just for real world work due to the docx file format. That said, a lot of open source Linux users do hate web apps because they're proprietary and they can just update on you and completely change. You don't have a choice on when you get to update a web app, and they're dependent on having internet access. But I do think that web applications are a really, really good stopgap for people who may be forced to use Microsoft Office, because you could just use the web version of Microsoft Office. So I'm building my own Linux distribution called stillOS, and one of the things I do with stillOS is completely bake in web app support and have super native web app integration. So I have one here for Microsoft Word Online, and I have one here for Google Docs, for example. I do want to get this technology on other Linux distros, but there are currently patches we have to make to the GNOME desktop to make it work, but I'm getting technical, I'll shut up. But the point is, utilize those web apps. They're a very useful stopgap for real world work. That said, even with the web apps for things like Microsoft Office, compatibility with super complex documents can still be hit or miss, so do test out your workflow using the web apps, using OnlyOffice, using LibreOffice before you make the switch to Linux, just to make sure everything's going to work right on your setup. Now let's talk about creative work on Linux, because this is another thing that is hit or miss, mainly because Linux does not have Adobe software almost at all. Now, this may be a good thing to some people, because I know the creative world right now is starting to hate Adobe, but there are decent alternatives for many tasks. So let's start with the big one, Photoshop. Everyone recommends GIMP. That is the open source option, but I'm just personally not a fan of GIMP. I have a couple videos about not liking GIMP on this channel, but just to summarize it, they aren't very good at UI or UX designs. So it kind of feels like a lot of the time they take a feature that works well in Photoshop and they're like, okay, GIMP needs this, but then they just don't look at how Photoshop implements it at all and comes up with their own entirely convoluted way of implementing it in GIMP. So in my personal experience, a lot of things that could take one or two steps in something like Photoshop or even alternatives like Photopea. In GIMP, there are a lot of situations where that will take 4 or 5 steps, which makes GIMP a lot more inefficient for real world use cases, in my opinion. Now, the tool I recommend for beginners on Linux instead is Photopea. This is actually another web application, unfortunately, but that is pretty much the only problem I have with it. It can do about 90% of what Photoshop can do. Basically, the only thing I've noticed it missing is a lot of Adobe's AI features are missing, which actually may be a pro to some people. But I use Photopea to make all my thumbnails. It has some basic AI features I like to use, like I like to use the remove background feature right here for my thumbnails. Whenever I have a thumbnail with my face in it, it's like one click, the background's gone. We have like blending options, which is a feature that I don't think GIMP has, that GIMP urgently needs. If you're trying to do image editing on Linux and you've been recommended GIMP and haven't liked GIMP, do try out Photopea. There's also Affinity Studio, which can run through some compatibility layers like Wine, although it isn't native and it is buggy, although I have heard rumors that in the future they're actually going to port Affinity to Linux, so do take that with a grain of salt. That is a rumor. And then if you aren't doing professional work, maybe you're a business owner and you need to make like social media posts or something, do check out Canva and Adobe Express web apps. Those are also good for some use cases on Linux. Now, vector graphics, I don't have much experience with this, so I can't really judge the quality of the software around, but Inkscape is an option, and it has worked well for the things I need it to do, such as just icons for stillOS. Again, Affinity works through compatibility layers, and Figma as a web app is great for UX and UI design. And then video editing, DaVinci Resolve is going to be the full alternative to Premiere Pro on Linux, and it does work great with two caveats. One, it can be difficult to install, so you're going to have to find a guide for your distro to get it installed. The other caveat is that the free version of DaVinci Resolve on Linux doesn't support that many codecs, because Linux in general doesn't come with them pre-installed due to licensing issues. So in order to get those codecs, you do have to pay for DaVinci Resolve Studio. If you're doing video work professionally, then that money will just make itself right back. But if you are using the free version of DaVinci Resolve, you will find yourself having to convert almost every video file you have into something that works on Resolve. That said, Kdenlive is also a great option. In some places, it can be a little bit more convoluted than DaVinci Resolve can be, but in general, every single edit I make for this channel, I could do if I wanted to in Kdenlive. It's a great piece of software worth checking out. Honestly, I do video editing work for other YouTubers who use DaVinci Resolve, so I need to export to DaVinci Resolve files, but if I didn't, I may just consider editing videos still in Kdenlive. That's how good Kdenlive is. Now, for music production, there are a few DAWs on Linux like Reaper, Bitwig, Studio One. Those are the big proprietary ones. There's also LMMS and Ardor as the open source DAWs. And you can kind of run FL Studio on Wine. I've had some good experiences with older versions, but newer versions for me tend to be a bit buggy on Wine. Wine's a Windows compatibility layer if you don't know what Wine is. That said though, a lot of audio plugins are not going to work on the Linux native versions. So I do have a 2019 MacBook. It is still an Intel Mac, but whatever. I don't need ARM for what I do, because the only thing I use that Mac for is music production, due to just the state of music production on Linux, in my opinion. Outside of all of those caveats though, if you're doing anything of this nature right here, things I mentioned at the beginning, web browsing, programming, schoolwork, system administration, reviving an old computer, privacy-focused computing, Linux actually is an excellent option for you, and you maybe should consider switching. But I also don't want to be one of those Linux shills that just blindly recommends Linux to everyone, not knowing their use case, and then people getting mad because they're unable to get their real world work done. So my advice for you, do not switch your work PC without testing other apps that can run on Linux. So keep Windows and Mac OS around at first, and just transition to Linux compatible apps on those operating systems, and then switch to Linux. All right, next up, let's talk about picking hardware and just general hardware support on Linux. My recommendation personally is to get a used laptop for testing out Linux. So I just recently did a video about buying a used ThinkPad. Because of corporations buying a whole fleet of ThinkPads like this, and then eventually when they want to upgrade their employees, they sell off all of the ThinkPads. You can actually get these for really cheap, and they're really good laptops for the price. I got this one for $140, and it runs Linux super well. Aside from ThinkPads, just used business laptops in general are a very safe bet. Other ones you can get are Lenovo IdeaPads, HP EliteBooks, Dell Inspiron, Latitude, and XPS laptops. But you can find really good deals on used laptops on less so eBay. eBay's good if you're in a rural area and you don't have access to Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace, but Facebook Marketplace specifically has really good deals on used laptops. And so that's what I recommend doing if you want to get into Linux for the first time, is just buying a used laptop, just a beater, and installing Linux onto that. Mainly though, just avoid weird, cheap laptops with very obscure Wi-Fi chips, because with used laptops like this, the Wi-Fi chip is what's going to get you on the Linux support, especially older laptops. That said, if you're looking to swap an existing computer over to Linux, the overwhelming majority of hardware should work. So out of the box, your CPU, your storage, your display, your keyboard, and your trackpad usually should work just fine, and AMD and Intel graphics are also usually smooth. Wi-Fi and Bluetooth does depend on the chip. Generally, this is a non-issue in the year 2026, but again, really weird and obscure Wi-Fi chips may have problems, and sometimes fingerprint readers can be hit or miss. Printers and scanners may be annoying as well, but usually popular models will actually work out of the box, no driver installation needed. But the one category of hardware right now to avoid completely is ARM hardware, so things like the M series MacBooks and laptops with Snapdragon chips. Yes, there are experimental ports of Linux like Asahi Linux for MacBooks, and yes, there are Linux supported Snapdragon laptops, but generally your experience on those is just not going to be as as good as x86 hardware, so I do not recommend ARM laptops for Linux. And then if you're buying a new computer, I would avoid Nvidia as well. Now, I understand that in the real world, many people already have Nvidia. It has been the gold standard for both gaming and AI workflows for years now. But that said, Nvidia is one of the only things on Linux that still requires extra drivers in the year 2026. And Nvidia has worse support for some modern graphics display stacks, especially older cards like a Nvidia 1080, for example, which there's still plenty of people running a 1080 in 2026. And then another thing is, if you want the least amount of friction, avoid hybrid GPU laptops. They do work on Linux, they just require a lot of extra configuration and things like that. There are distros that do support it natively, but then you're limited to those specific distros. Like I said, it's something that's possible, but if you want the least amount of friction, avoid that type of laptop. And all of this is why there's actually a famous clip of the creator of Linux, Linus Torvalds, giving Nvidia the bird. And then the last thing I want to bring up real quick is brand new hardware may have problems. So sometimes newer Wi-Fi chips may require newer kernels, and new GPUs may require just newer GPU drivers. And if you're buying a brand new laptop, sometimes a brand new laptop hasn't had support for sleep or audio or brightness or the fingerprint reader added to the kernel yet. So that is something to consider. If you're running a newer distribution, one that ships like newer packages like a Fedora, for example, or a non-LTS Ubuntu, it will generally support newer hardware out of the box better because it's not shipping an old kernel. But if you're trying to run something like Debian or Ubuntu LTS and you're not using the hardware enablement stack, then you may have some issues with new hardware. That said, though, it's pretty easy to research this. Just search your laptop model plus Linux before buying and look for known issues with Wi-Fi, suspend, audio, the GPU, and the fingerprint reader. And ultimately, you can actually test out your hardware with Linux without even installing Linux onto it, because you can actually put Linux onto a USB and use that live USB to test out your hardware. This is something almost every Linux distribution actually will support out of the box. My distribution, StillOS, is one of the few that doesn't. I'm still working on that. Should be coming. I am dropping a new update this week, and it won't be in that, but it should be in the next update. But that said, pretty much every other distribution will let you try out the distro on your hardware before you install it. And so from that environment, before you install it onto your computer, I do recommend just testing out Wi-Fi, testing out Bluetooth, audio, brightness controls, trackpad gestures, sleep and wake, and even just generally how well it runs on your hardware to see if maybe you want to go for a more lightweight distribution. But that said, Linux should work pretty well on the majority of hardware. Now, let's talk about picking a Linux distribution. Now, I'm gonna be honest, a lot of beginners just get completely stuck up on distro hopping. I'm not gonna lie, you should be able to use pretty much any Linux distribution. Yes, there are a lot of differences, but generally you'll be able to use almost any Linux distribution for almost any task you need to give it. And so the way I like to think of a Linux distribution is it's just a collection of packages, and these packages are just smaller Linux components essentially, and this collection of packages makes up the entire system to create a full operating system experience. So each desktop environment will come with a Linux kernel, behind the scenes system tools that you don't need to know about if you're a beginner, but things like init systems, stuff like that, a desktop environment, a set of pre-installed default apps, software repositories to add more apps, and a package manager, for example, and just different philosophies and ways of doing things. Some distributions will have different update cycles, things like that. In general, if you just think of a distribution as a collection of packages, you kind of realize you don't really need to distro hop that much. You can just change out defaults and things like that. Now, the thing that matters the most when you're picking a distribution is what the distribution is based on. So many distributions, including mine, are smaller community projects built on top of a major base distribution. And this is important because anything that isn't default will come from this base distribution. Now, there's 4 huge base distributions. There are other ones like OpenSUSE and NixOS, things like that. Generally, if you're using a smaller community distro, it's almost always going to be based on these 4 distributions. Maybe not almost always, but probably 90% of the time it's based on one of these 4. And so you have Arch Linux, which is a very DIY style Linux distribution and it's rolling release. So instead of having like you're coming from Windows, a Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 10, Windows 11, instead of a release cycle like that, you just have Arch Linux and it continually updates. And this is the best for people who want absolute control over their computer, as well as just bleeding edge packages, the latest version of everything, and a platform to build your own custom system on top of. But if you're watching this video, you're probably a beginner. I do not recommend anything based on Arch Linux, and I'll get to why that is in a second. Next up, we have Debian. This is an uncompromisingly stable bedrock designed for both servers and pragmatists who prioritize predictability and system staticness. This is a great stable base for building things, and this is actually what Ubuntu is based off of, although Ubuntu makes so many different changes on top of Debian that it pretty much acts completely like a different distribution entirely, so that's why Ubuntu has its own section here. And then there's Fedora, which is a forward-thinking, developer-centric workstation that delivers a polished, highly secure, and cutting-edge showcase of modern open-source innovations. So Fedora, basically, every time there's something new in the Linux space, as soon as it's stable, it's pre-installed on Fedora. And then you have the Ubuntu base, a convenient, beginner-friendly gateway that trades some user control and packaging transparency for maximum compatibility, ease of use, and enterprise support. Now, I will say, out of these four bases, if you're a beginner, I do recommend an Ubuntu base, and then I'd put Fedora as number 2. Like I said, Arch is terrible for beginners, and Debian is decent for beginners. It's just very slow moving, and if you're running base Debian, you have to do a bunch of extra steps to set it up. I do recommend for base distributions to try and find something that is either based on Ubuntu and Fedora with an asterisk that I'll get to later. Now, another thing to look for when picking a distribution is desktop environments, and this dictates the entire user interface of your computer, and different desktop environments will make your computer function completely differently. So the two gold standard desktop environments on Linux are GNOME and KDE Plasma. So GNOME is minimalist, beautiful, polished, and consistent. A lot of people like to call GNOME the Apple of Linux, and it can be a little opinionated. Sometimes they make weird design decisions, but it's going to be a very polished and consistent experience. It has a whole ecosystem of apps built around it, and if you know how to use one GNOME app, you know how to use all the GNOME apps. And then there's KDE Plasma. Out of the box, this is kind of going to be like Windows, but the thing about KDE is it's very customizable, powerful, flexible, expansive. But if you're a brand new to Linux, it may be a little overwhelming how many options it gives you. I've read comments in my YouTube videos before saying that opening the KDE system settings gives them anxiety because of how many options there are. But you can form KDE Plasma to be almost anything you want. So people love KDE Plasma for that. Now, there are many, many more Linux desktop environments I'm not covering, but I just want to cover two more real quick that I think beginners may want to look into. You have the Cinnamon desktop, and this is very traditional, familiar, comfortable, practical. So this is great if you're coming from Windows because it's going to give you a very like Windows 7 like user interface and it just works. And then there's XFCE, which is going to be a little bit more old school, but the thing about XFCE is it's very lightweight, stable, simple, and efficient. And so if you have like an old computer you're trying to revive with Linux, I would recommend looking into XFCE. It can be ugly out of the box, but you can make it look pretty good with themes. And sometimes the workflow can be dated, but it really does breathe new life into older computers. Now, like I said, there's a lot of other desktop environments I'm not mentioning too. There's Mate, there's the new Cosmic Desktop, LXQt, there's all the window managers, Budgie, but these are just the four that I recommend for brand new people to Linux. And even out of these four, I probably would only recommend XFCE to a beginner if you're trying to revive an old computer. Now, one other thing I want to point out is there's been a trend lately of these new atomic distributions. So the difference between an atomic distribution and a traditional distribution is traditional distributions let you directly modify the system and change out all the packages and stuff. So it is going to give you more control over your system, and traditional systems can be easier to understand if you need to go deep or you need to troubleshoot something, but it's going to require more manual maintenance over time to run. Whereas an atomic distribution is going to keep the core system controlled as like one image, basically. They often use universal packages and containers more heavily, which sounds scary, but it can be seamless on most distributions, such as mine still. And atomic systems can also be easier to recover if something goes wrong. So there are trade-offs to both atomic and traditional. In my opinion, if you install an atomic distribution and it works the first time and you don't have any issues, use, it's going to last a lot longer without any manual maintenance, and that's why people like atomic distributions. But if you have maybe some obscure hardware and you need some weird driver or something, you might want to go for more traditional Linux distribution, because sometimes trying to get that stuff running on an atomic distribution can be a pain. Anyways, I just want to plug my Linux distribution real quick, stillOS. This is a newer atomic distribution. It is still small. I'm working on getting a community around it and turning this into a big distribution. The goal of this distro is to build the ultimate install, set, and forget, curated, out-of-the-box Linux experience made for regular people, something I'd be comfortable installing on my mom's computer and not worrying about. We have our own custom app store with a curated app selection with ratings on how well each app works on stillOS. As I mentioned earlier, we have native-feeling web apps to try and act as a stopgap for app compatibility on Linux. It's very customizable, and I would just appreciate it if you guys check it out. Now, other than my own distro stillOS, here are some of my other personal recommendations for beginners. Linux Mint is usually a good general start. If you don't know anything about Linux, Linux Mint is my go-to recommendation. It ships the Cinnamon desktop, which, like I said earlier, very similar to Windows. It's built on a stable Ubuntu base, and pretty much the only thing Linux Mint isn't good for is if you have brand new hardware. Linux Mint also has XFCE and Mate options, which are great for older hardware, and it has a 2-year update cycle, so there's a new major release of Linux Mint every 2 years, and you don't really have to worry about doing a major upgrade even longer than 2 years, because they usually support a Mint release even longer than that. So Ubuntu ships its own take on the GNOME desktop with variants for pretty much any other desktop you might want to run. If you do go with Ubuntu, I do recommend learning about snap packages, which can be hit or miss, and I'll cover those later in the video. And it either has a 2-year LTS update cycle, which you may like if you want to have a more stable system and not worry about doing major OS upgrades, or you can go for a 6-month cutting edge update cycle where you're getting the latest software, great hardware support. Both of those are good options. And then Fedora, if you're willing to learn just a little bit more of Linux beyond the basics, I do recommend Fedora. Very stable base with flagship editions being GNOME and KDE Plasma, but they have spins for pretty much every other desktop. Sometimes it may require some extra steps to get up and running, like you may have to install an extra repo for proprietary software to get things like Steam working. If you want an atomic base, which I talked about earlier, and that interests you, Fedora has atomic variants called Silverblue, which is using the GNOME desktop, and Kinoite, which uses the KDE desktop. And so those are very good if a atomic system sounds appealing to you. And Fedora has a 6-month release cycle. You're getting the latest software, but each Fedora release is still pretty stable, so Fedora is also pretty good to look into. Now, I do want to shout out Universal Blue as well if you are interested in atomic distributions. Universal Blue is a group that makes 3 different atomic Linux distributions that are ready to go out of the box for new users. So you have Bazite, which is a gaming ready spin with images for desktop gamers as well as home theater / console setups, and dedicated Nvidia images with both GNOME and KDE desktop options. So if you're running Nvidia, this is a good option where you don't have to worry about Nvidia. The other 2 distros that the Universal team works on is Aurora and Bluefin, which are both very easy to use, low maintenance, general purpose distributions. Aurora uses KDE Plasma and Bluefin uses GNOME. So I do recommend those for beginners if you want some sort of atomic setup and you don't want to use stillOS. Now, lastly, if you're a beginner, please do not go with an Arch-based distro unless you really want to dive deep into Linux. And this includes distributions like EndeavourOS, CachyOS, and Manjaro, which are very popular, but not what I would recommend to a beginner. The main issue is that Arch is a rolling release, so there may be manual intervention required for some updates that involves doing work in the command line, and also compatibility breaking updates will not be saved for another distro release. So if you're running Fedora or Ubuntu, if there's some sort of change in the software that isn't backwards compatible, it would be saved for the next release and you don't have to deal with it until you do a major OS upgrade. Whereas on Arch Linux, because it's rolling release, the update will just happen under you and then you have to deal with it after the fact. And this is especially bad if you're running the GNOME desktop, which a lot of workflows on GNOME involve GNOME extensions, which are like plugins for GNOME kind of, and those plugins need to be updated for each version of GNOME. So when Arch updates GNOME for under you, it's going to break all your GNOME extensions. Additionally, many Arch-based distros give you very easy access to the AUR, or the Arch user repository, which the AUR is useful, but if you don't know what you're doing, it can be risky and be a double-edged sword. And then if you're running base Arch, it's very difficult to install and requires knowledge of a Linux system to make choices for your specific use case. You have to kind of know everything you want want on your Linux system. That said, Arch does have the Arch Wiki, which is one of the best sources of documentation on Linux. If you want to learn Linux, I highly recommend looking into the Arch Wiki and maybe doing a manual installation of Arch. Like, if we go through the install guide, this is somewhat difficult and not something I would dive straight into if you're brand new to Linux, but this is a great way to learn Linux by just forcing you to actually learn it to get this type of system installed. So I do love Arch Linux, I just would not recommend it at all to beginners. With all of that, let's talk about preparing yourself to actually install Linux now. So before you install Linux, just know that installing Linux is going to wipe the drive that you install it onto. So make sure to back up all your important files. Even if they're on a separate drive, you don't want to accidentally install Linux onto the wrong drive and wipe your files. So I would just back up everything important you have. As I mentioned earlier, make sure you're able to do all of your important work on Linux. So as I recommended earlier, maybe transition to using some Linux apps on Windows or Mac OS before you switch to Linux, and use the live USB feature that most Linux systems have to test out your hardware. Now, a lot of people want to try Linux out before installing it, so live USBs are the best for testing out your hardware. It's just the best representation you're going to get of your hardware before you install anything. Virtual machines do work if maybe you're trying to see if you like a certain desktop environment or user interface. However, many distributions will perform very bad in VMs or just not work at all. So it's not a very good representation of the distro's quality or performance. And so honestly, as I mentioned earlier, if you are getting started to Linux, I just recommend installing it onto a spare computer or a spare laptop, something like that. Now, another thing a lot of people like to do is dual boot. So this basically allows you to install Linux distributions alongside Windows. That said, again, back everything up, because if you do not understand hard drive partitioning, it's very easy to accidentally wipe data. I also do not recommend doing this on a single drive, which many distributions let you install Linux alongside Windows on the same drive with one click, because Windows Update doesn't recognize a Linux bootloader and likes to wipe Linux bootloaders. And I've actually personally had Windows Update wipe entire Linux partitions from my system, including all my data on Linux. So because of this, I would recommend dual booting with two different drives. So either an external hard drive or maybe a second internal drive if you're using it on a desktop computer. Or maybe if you just occasionally need Windows, you could get an external hard drive and put Windows on that and then just have Linux on your main internal drive. But be careful with the dual booting. With all of that, this is my personal first boot checklist whenever I install a new Linux system. First thing I do is I run an update, and then I'll go in and check my display settings, make sure I'm using the right refresh rate and resolution. I'll check out my audio configurations. And then if you're on an Ubuntu based distribution, you generally won't have a problem with this. But if you're on something like Fedora, you may need to install extra repositories to get things like Nvidia drivers or Steam. And speaking of Nvidia drivers, if you're running Nvidia, you're going to want to install those. Then you can install your essential apps and start customizing your desktop. Now, quickly, I just want to go through some quick Linux concepts that I think every Linux beginner should know. These are all important to using a Linux system. First off is the terminal, and I don't actually think you have to learn the terminal. I just wanted to talk about it for a second because the terminal does tend to scare new Linux users. So the Linux terminal or the command line is very powerful and allows you to do almost anything to your system. And the Linux terminal is what gives you complete control over your computer on a Linux system. And because of that, many Linux guides will tell you to use just terminal commands, which can be intimidating to new users, but a lot of things in the terminal you can do through a GUI. It's just easier to direct someone to just paste in a terminal command than it is to tell them to click this program, then navigate to this tab, then click this button. And so because of that, a lot of Linux guides tend to always use the terminal. That said, do not copy and paste commands from sources you do not trust. Like I said, the terminal can do anything you want to your system, and that includes installing malware on it. So just make sure you trust a command before you run it. Also, you should know about the root user. So this is sort of the Linux version of an admin account on Windows. So most files not inside of your user directory, which on Linux is the home folder, they're only writable by the root account. And so some actions such as installing software require a password to use the root account to do it. And if you're ever trying to use a Linux terminal and you come across a sudo command, what that sudo command does is it runs everything after it in the command as an administrator. So running untrusted commands commands, the sudo command can be a good red flag to look out for, just because that means you're running that command as an administrator, essentially. Now, next up, let's talk about package managers. So most traditional Linux distributions come with a package manager for managing system level packages, and different base distributions are going to use different package managers. So if you're running Ubuntu or Debian, you're going to be using apt with .deb files if you're downloading a program off of the internet. And if you're on Fedora, you're going to be using DNF or .rpm packages. And then on Arch, there aren't that many Arch packages out in the wild just on the internet, but the package manager you're going to be using is called Pacman. There's a couple other distros with their own package manager, but generally you're just going to be coming across apt, DNF, and Pacman. Now, these package managers are going to install everything on the system level, and they're used for everything from system components like your desktop environment all the way to just apps on your system. So do make sure that you trust all the packages on your system. If you're installing it straight from a distro's own repositories, they're generally vetted and safe. The ones that are not as well vetted is the AUR or third-party external repositories if you're running Fedora, Debian, or Ubuntu. And that said, do note that these packages are not all universal. For example, if you find a .deb package on the web for Ubuntu, there's a chance it might not work on Debian and can break your system. Now, outside of the distro-specific package managers, there are going to be universal package managers that are going to work well on most Linux distributions, often running apps within containers. So Flatpak is the most common one you'll run into. Flatpak apps are ran in a sandbox and universally supported on almost every Linux distribution, and they're mostly loved by the community, although some people do not like Flatpaks because they may have container issues you need to account for, such as Steam. If you want to put games on an external drive, you may have to do some stuff in the terminal or install an app like FlatSeal in order to actually get Steam to recognize that external drive. Another packaging format that's popular is snap packages, which also run in a sandbox, but they're primarily only used on Ubuntu because other distro maintainers don't like them due to the only source to get snaps being the proprietary snap store, and people don't like Canonical having all that control. That isn't something I personally care that much about. I just want my software to work. But what I do care about is a lot of the time there's a lot of snap packages that aren't very well maintained and not updated, and Ubuntu likes to prioritize snaps over the native .deb packages. So in that case, you may want to double check that the snap package is actually newer than the .deb package, because you don't want to get an unmaintained snap on your system that could be a potential security risk. And in my opinion, for beginners, this is the biggest problem with Ubuntu, is how poorly maintained the snap store can be. And then finally, there are app images too, and these aren't like repository-based package managers like the other ones are. These are more like portable.exe files. And these also work on nearly any Linux distribution, except some older app images may require extra libraries that you have to manually install on your system, like libfuse2, for example. So if app images do not work out of the box, that is something to look into to fix it. Generally though, if you're new to Linux, I do recommend researching the difference between a native system package manager and then all of these universal formats, finding out the pros and the cons. I'm actually going to put a video I made about this at the end screen for if you want more information about this. And then the last thing I want to talk about real quick is just X11/X Libre versus Wayland. So Linux is currently in the middle of a transition for its primary display server, and the display server is basically how the desktop is going to actually display graphics onto your computer. And so Wayland is the new one, and it is generally used by modern versions of GNOME and Plasma and recommended due to just better security and a modernized graphics stack, whereas X11 is the old one, and there's a new fork called X Libre as well, and this is used by some older desktop environments who haven't yet made the switch to Wayland yet. But also on some setups, X11 will still work better, especially if you heavily utilize remote desktop setups or have older hardware that may not have great Wayland support, especially like older Nvidia cards. Like if you have a 1080, your Wayland support won't be very good. That said, this isn't something you should have to think about, but I just wanted to point this out because you may see debates and arguments about this in the Linux community, so I just wanted to put this there so that you guys actually know what they're talking about. And it also may be a useful distinction for troubleshooting if you're trying to get help. It's useful to know if someone's on X11 or Wayland when trying to help someone troubleshoot. Finally, if you need any help, most Linux distributions are going to have a dedicated help forum where you can ask for help. And also most Linux distributions have some sort of chat either a Discord, Matrix, or IRC server. Many distros will have at least one of those three. Feel free to check out the stillHQ community in the description below. Yes, this is primarily made for my distro stillOS, but this is a community of people who are like realists. I'm trying to keep this community to not be elitist, so we're not going to make fun of you for any distribution that you choose to use. Because this community is made for stillOS, which itself is a distribution made for people who just don't want to deal with Linux and want it to just work, there isn't going to be Linux elitists in our Discord server, so we have a pretty nice community, which I'm proud of, albeit it is small right now, but we're going to grow it. You don't have to run stillOS. I'm happy to help people out if they need help. Just please don't spam ping me or DM me, though. I'm a busy guy. Reddit is also a very good place to get user support, as well as local Linux user groups, also known as lugs. You'd be surprised how many cities in America actually have a Linux user group to go to. And finally, if you're asking people for help, make sure to include any relevant logs, screenshots, hardware info, or things you've already tried before asking for help. If you don't know how to do that, someone is probably happy to help you do that if you just ask. With all of that, I hope that this guide was helpful to you and gave you some good pointers on what to do in your brand new journey to Linux. If anyone else has any advice that you may think is useful, drop a comment below. You can subscribe for more Linux-focused videos right here. Help support a broke college student on Patreon. Right here, I'll put my video about snaps, Flatpaks, and app images. And right here, I'm going to have a distro tier list video that talks about pretty much every Linux distro that is relevant and the use cases. So this may be a good starter list if you're looking for a Linux distribution. With all that, peace out.